Can words kill? It's a question that sits at the very heart of a tragedy that put modern communication on trial. A teenage romance lived mostly through thousands and thousands of text messages, ended with one person dead and the other facing a conviction for manslaughter. This is a story of Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy, and how a relationship that existed almost entirely on a glowing screen had devastatingly real consequences. It's a story about loneliness, mental illness, and a single chilling command that a judge would ultimately rule as the cause of death. The relationship between Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy was almost like a fantasy, but it was built on a foundation of shared despair. Their connection spiraled into a tragedy that would challenge the entire legal system. You have a young man who is convinced his life isn't worth living, and a young woman who, for reasons we're still debating, agreed with him. And it all came to a head on a summer evening with Conrad Roy sitting in his truck as poisonous fumes began to fill the cab. But then he got scared. He got out of the truck. He called his girlfriend, Michelle Carter, and what she said in that moment would become the focus of an international firestorm and a trial that delivered a shocking verdict. Yes, words alone can kill. On the evening of July the 13th, 2014, police in Fairhaven, Massachusetts, were called to check on a young man found unresponsive in his pickup truck, which was parked in a huge, mostly empty Kmart parking lot. Inside, they found a body of 18-year-old Conrad Roy III. Cause of death was quickly identified as carbon monoxide poisoning. He had used a water pump to fill the cab with fumes. Now, at first, it looked like a tragic, but sadly not unheard of story of a young man taking his own life. Conrad had a history of depression and had even attempted suicide before. His family knew he was struggling. He was a newly licensed tugboat captain with his whole life ahead of him, but he was deeply troubled. The case could have ended right there, a private tragedy for a grieving family. But there was a crucial piece of evidence in Conrad's pocket, his smartphone. Now, investigators started scrolling through his final communications, looking for clues about his state of mind. They found something they never expected. This wasn't a story of someone in solitary despair. It was a dialogue. His phone held the entire history of his relationship with his 17-year-old long-distance girlfriend, Michelle Carter. And as detectives scrolled back through the days and weeks before his death, a much starker story started to take shape. The messages showed that Conrad wasn't alone in his final moments. Michelle had been with him virtually every step of the way. And she wasn't just watching it happen, she was coaching him through it. The story of Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy didn't start in their Massachusetts hometowns, but hundreds of miles away in Florida. In 2012, both happened to be on vacation with their families, and they were introduced, and from all accounts, they really hit it off. They were two teenagers who felt like outsiders, and they saw a bit of themselves in each other. But after that first meeting, the relationship would exist almost entirely online. Over the next 2 years, they met in person less than 5 times. The entire love story was written in thousands upon thousands of text messages. They built this intense, private world where they could confess their deepest insecurities and darkest thoughts without the pressure of having to see each other. In a way, their romance was a performance for an audience of two, a story they were writing together, text by text. This disconnect from reality was a huge part of their relationship. They made plans to see each other, but then they'd almost always get canceled. For Michelle, it seemed the relationship gave her a role to play, the caring, devoted girlfriend to a troubled, poetic boy. Prosecutors would later argue that she craved that attention that the role brought her, and that craving eventually turned into something much more sinister. Their story became a cautionary tale about loneliness and where the line between a real connection and a fake identity can get dangerously blurry. And now, at the heart of their relationship was a shared struggle with mental health. Both Conrad and Michelle were dealing with teenage depression and anxiety, and their texts became a raw, unfiltered diary of their pain. This was the glue that held them together. Conrad was He was bright, a sensitive kid, but he was haunted by deep depression and social anxiety. He'd been in therapy, he was taking medication, and he had even attempted suicide back in 2012. His family knew he was struggling, but his despair and um, it was just a powerful force. He even recorded video diaries talking about his loneliness and self-loathing. One video, he said, "I've created a monster in my head, and that monster is me." He had been researching suicide methods online long before Michelle became so involved. Michelle Carter was also struggling. She had an eating disorder and felt incredibly lonely and isolated from her peers. She too was on psychiatric medication, first Prozac, and then later was switched to Celexa. And for context, that is the same medication Conrad was taking, except he was taking the generic form of it. Now, with Conrad, she found someone who seemed to get it. At times, their shared suicidal thoughts took on this bizarre, romanticized quality. And then, Conrad once suggested they could be like Romeo and Juliet. It was a fantasy that seemed to appeal to Michelle. Her defense team would later say she often borrowed her script from TV shows like Glee, especially an episode where a character mourns the death of her boyfriend. Now, for a while, Michelle seemed to be supportive, encouraging Conrad to get some help. And older messages, she would write things like, "We're going to get through this." But as the summer of 2014 rolled around, the whole dynamic of the relationship and Michelle's messages started to take on a very different, chilling turn. And the weeks leading up to Conrad's death, something dramatically changed in Michelle Carter's text. The girlfriend who once told him to get help started relentlessly pressuring him to kill himself. Her tone went from supportive to impatient, frustrated, and finally demanding. Prosecutors would later argue that she had become a manipulative girl who was tired of Conrad's hesitation. They claimed that she saw his death as a way to finally get the attention and sympathy she desperately wanted. She would get to play the part of the tragic, grieving girlfriend, which would make her important to her friends. The proof was right there in the text. Some of them said, "You're finally going to be happy in heaven. No more pain," she wrote. "It's okay to be scared, and it's normal. I mean, you're about to die." When Conrad hesitated, Michelle got more insistent. She started scolding him for putting it off. She said, "You keep pushing it off and you say you'll do it, but you never do. It's always going to be that way if you don't take action." One of those messages read, "I thought you wanted to do this. The next time is right and you're ready. You just need to do it." She texted that on the morning he died. She helped him research methods, discussing how well a generator and carbon monoxide would work. She helped him plan everything, telling him where to go, what to do. And when he worried about his family, she told him they'd understand and move on. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She had become one of the main drivers. Her words were creating a trap, closing everything off except for the one she was pushing him towards. The big question for everyone was why? Was this some misguided attempt to help him in his suffering? Or was it a cold, calculated plot to make herself the center of a tragedy? July the 12th, 2014 was the final day. The text from that morning showed Michelle's mounting impatience. "You can't think about it. You just have to do it. You said you were going to do it." July 12th was the final day. The text from that morning showed Michelle's mounting impatience. They said, "You can't think about it. You just have to do it. You said you were going to do it. Like, I don't get why you aren't." And Conrad's replies were full of fear, but Michelle shot down every single one of his doubts. That evening, Conrad drove his Ford F-250 pickup truck to the Kmart parking lot, and he had the gas-powered water pump with him. The plan was in motion. He was on the phone with Michelle for two long calls, one for 43 minutes and one 47 minutes. And what happened during those calls is what the entire case against her would hinge on. According to a text Michelle sent to a friend months later, Conrad had a moment of doubt. As the carbon monoxide started to fill the truck, he got scared. The reality of it hit him, and he did what anyone else would do. He got out of the truck. He told Michelle on the phone that he was scared, that he didn't want to die. The judge in the case would later call this the moment The chain of causation was broken. He had made a choice to live, but Michelle, miles away, made her own choice over the phone. She gave him a direct order: get back in. That command, given to a terrified, vulnerable boy whose will had been worn down over weeks, was the point of no return. And Conrad listened. He got back into the truck. Michelle Carter stayed on the phone with him, listening as he coughed, as the sounds of the engine faded, as he took his last breaths. She never called 911. She never called his family. She did nothing. And the days after Conrad's death, Michelle Carter started playing the part of heartbroken girlfriend. She sent texts to Conrad's mom, pretending she had no idea what happened and was just as confused as she was. She posted tributes on social media, mourning the love of her life. She even organized a charity softball tournament in his name in her hometown, making sure she was at the very center of the tragedy. But behind the scenes, she was telling her friends a completely different story, and that's what did her in. Less than 2 months after Conrad's death, she sent a shocking confession to her friend. It said, "Sam, his death is my fault. Like, honestly, I could have stopped him. I was on the phone with him, and he got out of the car because it was working, and he got scared, and I fucking told him to get back in. I couldn't have him live the way he was living anymore. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't let him." These were the texts that became the smoking gun for investigators. They realized Conrad hadn't acted alone. His will had been completely overridden by the person he trusted most. In February of 2015, about 7 months after Conrad died, a grand jury indicted Michelle Carter for involuntary manslaughter. Because she was 17 at the time, she was charged as a youthful offender, meaning she could still be sentenced as an adult. The stage was set for a landmark trial that would test the limits of the law. In June 2017, Michelle Carter's trial began. Her defense team made a strategic choice to have a bench trial, which means just a single judge that would decide her fate instead of a jury. This wasn't a typical manslaughter case. There was no physical weapons, and the defendant was miles away. The entire case rested on words. The prosecution argued that Michelle Carter had waged a campaign of psychological warfare against Conrad Roy, the thousands of texts that were the main evidence showing her escalating the pressure. They said that her motive was to get attention as the grieving girlfriend, but the core of their argument was that final phone call. When Conrad got out of the truck, he broke the chain of events. It was Carter's command, "get back in," that directly caused his death. They argued her words weren't just words. They were a form of verbal assault. The defense fought back. First, they argued that Conrad was determined to end his own life and had made that decision on his own long before Michelle's text became so intense. They pointed to this. They pointed to his past suicide attempt and his own research as proof. Second, they focused on Michelle's own mental state. They brought in a psychiatrist, and he argued that Michelle was involuntarily intoxicated because her antidepressant medication had recently been switched from Prozac to Celexa. He claimed this change could impair her judgment and gave her a delusion that she had to help Conrad to get to heaven. And third, they argued her words were protected by the First Amendment right to free speech. They said convicting her would set a dangerous precedent. They tried to frame her text as the ramblings of an immature teenager caught up in a fantasy world, even bringing up her obsession with the show Glee as proof that she was detached from reality. The whole trial felt surreal, with silent moments in the courtroom as everyone read the damning text flashing across screens. On June 16th, 2017, the judge delivered his verdict. He found Michelle Carter guilty of involuntary manslaughter, but his reasoning was very specific. He didn't convict her for all the text or for just generally encouraging suicide. He pinpointed the exact moment her actions became a crime. The judge said it wasn't her command to get back in the truck that was the wanton and reckless conduct that led to Conrad's death. He explained that by ordering him back into what she knew was a toxic environment and then doing nothing to help him, like calling 911 or his family, she became responsible. Her actions, he said, overwhelmed Conrad's will to live at that critical moment. On August 3rd, 2017, Carter was sentenced to 2.5 years with 15 months to be served in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. Her lawyers immediately appealed, so she was allowed to stay free while the case made its way through the courts. In February 2019, the highest court in Massachusetts upheld her conviction, rejecting her free speech arguments. Her lawyers then took the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, but in January of 2020, the court declined to hear it. And that was the end of the line. Michelle Carter began her prison sentence on February the 11th, 2019, and she was released early for good behavior, January 23rd, 2020, after serving about 11. The conviction of Michelle Carter really divided people and left behind a complicated legacy. It sparked huge debates about cyberbullying, mental health, and how the law should handle crimes in the digital world. Since her release from prison and the end of her probation in August 2022, Michelle Carter has stayed completely out of the public eye. For the Roy family, the end of the legal battle brought some closure, but not an end to their pain. They focused on honoring Conrad's memory and advocating for mental health awareness. At its core, this case is a story of profound human loss. A young man who lost his life, a young woman whose actions will forever define her by his death. The story of Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy is a tragedy with no winners. It's a dark, cautionary tale of our time where relationships can be lived through screens and the weight of our words can travel miles in an instant. A Massachusetts court drew a line in the sand saying that, yes, words can be a weapon when they're used to coerce a vulnerable person into a fatal act. So, what do you think? It's such a complex case, and I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. Where do you think the line should be drawn between free speech and criminal responsibility? Be sure to like and subscribe. Tell a friend. This is The Dark Room. See you for the next one.